Hello. It's my great pleasure to give you a warm welcome today to our short conversations with legal thinkers series. We have Jennifer Nedelsky from the University of Oslo today. And for those who are watching us out there, could you say a few words as a way of introduction?
Okay, so I actually have an interdisciplinary background. My doctorate is from the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, a very old interdisciplinary department. And for many years, I had an appointment at the University of Toronto, joint law and political science. And I often tell people that I have degrees in neither. In fact, early on when I was very interested in politics and sought out the Committee on Social Thought to go as a place to actually study all that was involved in politics, the two fields that never occurred to me to go into were law and political science. But I have found myself there, and happily so. So I used to teach joint, 50% law, 50% political science, but then I wanted to move to a part-time job, and I wanted to move to a social justice law school, and so I moved to Ascot Hall Law School at York University, and I'm very happy there, and teach mostly legal theory related courses, feminist theory, legal theory, course on judgment.
Right. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your experience as a teacher of legal theory, legal philosophy. How would you characterize your own approach to the field? And in fact, how would you characterize or define the field itself, the field of jurisprudence? So you prefer the name jurisprudence, legal theory, political philosophy?
So I often list two different subfields of mine, political theory and legal theory. I don't think of them as quite identical. So now that I'm teaching at Osgood, one of the ways I've really thought about this is I teach a graduate legal theory course. So the graduate students all have to take one of 4 or 5 what they call study groups. So these are mostly people who want to be legal academics. So that's a subset. But I say that I've constructed the course in a way that I think draws together legal theory readings that will be helpful to them as teachers of law, as practitioners of law, because they will be teaching practitioners of law, and as scholars of law. That it should do all those things. And those are slightly different in what's needed, but I see them also as interrelated. So in that course, part of what's really fun about it is I make sure that in each class we connect the readings that I've assigned to the research the students are involved in. So about half of them are master's students, LLM students, and half of them are doctoral students. And a huge range, criminal law, administrative law, all different kinds of things. It really works very well to ask them to concretely think about how does this reading make a difference to how you think about law in your research. So for JD students, most of whom are not planning to be legal academics, I think my deepest commitment there is that everyone who's engaged in law, practice of any kind, is engaged in shaping the law. And it's important that they have had a chance during their legal studies to think about how law structures relationships, whether it's in the family or in business, how it structures power, how it structures patterns of advantage and disadvantage, and how it intersects with issues of norms, which we'll come back to, like the norms of who does care work. There are legal structures that reinforce norms which formally aren't law. So I think it's important for every law student to really reflect during their training on how their role as a lawyer is going to shape people's daily lives and their deepest values.
I wanted to ask a follow-up question on the role of theory, on the role of jurisprudence. Do you see that it has some value also within the law school itself?
Yes, I had a graduate student, a doctoral student at U of T who was writing about how contract law is taught. and the difference between the teacher's ideas about what they actually believe about law and how they teach. So roughly speaking, a difference between, a deeply contextual political understanding of law on the one hand versus, a fairly formalistic teaching methodology and examination methodology. And when we were having our conversations about the dissertation, I realized that one of the most important ways that theory plays out in the first instance is how people teach or think they're teaching. And then that in turn shapes how students are coming to learn law. So I think that legal theory actually pervades legal education, whether people think about it or not, just like I think the implications of legal theory pervade legal practice, whether people think about it or not.
Indeed. I wanted to ask you also of your different experiences in different law schools. You mentioned that you did your PhD in Chicago, and you've been many years at the University of Toronto. Now you're teaching at Osgood. How have those different experiences shaped your understanding of the different contexts of law itself?
So I would add one other institution. So my first teaching job was at Princeton University, which doesn't have a law school, but I was teaching law courses, so constitutional law and law and society at Princeton. And so I think Chicago was really formative, partly because a really important experience for me was my supervisor was Hannah Arendt. And so that was for a young woman who had, gone to university in the 60s and never had a female faculty member. Then my supervisor turns out to be Hannah Arendt, who is the smartest person I've ever met. That was very, very important for me. But also to have spent my graduate courses and discussions with people from many different disciplines and always thinking about problems in an interdisciplinary perspective, I think that has deeply shaped my understanding of law. I think everything I do has an interdisciplinary dimension to it. And I will say it's kind of challenging for me as a scholar because I constantly feel, now I need to read the psychology, and now I need to read the sociology, and now I need to read the economics, because I never can see any problem as isolated. But I hope that then my students have the benefit of that integration. I think in terms of the actual teaching at the law schools, both U of T and Osgood allowed me a great deal of flexibility in how I taught and what I teach. And I will say that overwhelmingly, I've had the advantage of having self-selected students. I teach almost no required courses, so UBC is unusual in requiring legal theory. But I do find Osgood a place that I feel more at home now. That wasn't true when I first got to U of T, but because there is such a pervasive ethos of being concerned about commitments to equality, to social justice, to the impact of law. That is a shared norm, and the differences are, how you best approach it. And I really find that a very congenial environment.
Mm-hmm. I also wanted to ask you about your book, Law's Relations, which I have here. You mentioned the idea of intellectual integration, but the idea of relationality is certainly very important for your work. You develop a relational theory of law. I wanted to ask you a very basic question about what was the idea behind the book? What do you think is the main contribution that the book is offering?
So I think that, it was a very long time in the making, that book. I had started out, my first book was on private property and the American Constitution and the way in which a preoccupation with protecting property had shaped the structure of the American Constitution. And as I spent more and more time thinking about law, I was more and more interested in the ways that law shapes the relational structure of our lives in almost every dimension. You could imagine a culture in which law did not have this pervasive influence, but in almost all post-industrial societies, law is tremendously important. And so when you try to think about how families function, how the economy functions, how workplaces function, we can't understand any of those questions without understanding the role of law. And to me, the most helpful way of asking those questions is, how is law structuring those relations? Mm-hmm. And then I extend that to the language of rights, because for many people who aren't lawyers and don't think about law, but they do think about rights. Rights is a language which encompasses a much wider scope. But I think the same basic claims can be made about rights as about law. That is, it's best to understand rights as means of structuring relationships, which can foster or undermine core values like equality or dignity or security. And I think if we bring that question to bear, all the specific questions, like should something be called right? Is healthcare a right? Or is property, should it be constitutionalized? So I think it shouldn't. Canada doesn't, one of the few Western constitutions that doesn't. All those questions, and how should we interpret any given right? Those questions will be best reflected on through a lens of relationality.
Another important aspect, I think, of your approach is a feminist approach as well. And from that perspective, you've written about the need of legal reform, about gender violence and violence within the family. How does this relational approach reconceptualize or help us to address those questions, those issues?
Well, I think one of the ways is to see that the particular dynamics of how law structures relationships, gendered relationships, is really a subset of this broader approach. I think it matters not to see the relational dimension of gender dynamics, for example, including violence, as peculiar to feminism or peculiar to the family or peculiar to women. That's part of why I like the idea of a relational approach to all of law, so that we don't cabin those questions around feminism and gender as uniquely relational. So, for example, violence, I think sadly, we now really know that you cannot stop violence against women just by passing quite good laws. So Canada has pretty much exemplary laws on sexual assault, and doesn't seem to make much difference, actually, either in the rates of violence or, even more sadly or equally sadly, what happens in the courtrooms. And so we have to not lose sight of the role of law, but always think about how it's intersecting with other kinds of norms and practices that sustain dominance, that make it acceptable. Because really, I think we could not have the rates of either domestic violence or sexual assault that are true throughout North America if it were not tolerated socially at many levels. And that's a kind of shocking thing to say, because everybody thinks, oh no, well, it's against the law, nobody approves of it. But if really nobody tolerated it, it could not prevail at the levels that it does. And so I think the relational approach fosters what I was talking about before, this interdisciplinary approach of thinking about how the law intersects with non-legal norms to sustain practices that we're trying to change. So when I teach my feminism course, well, now I called Law, Gender, and Equality at Osgoode, I often ask the students to think about both where is the law complicit and where do we have to go outside the law? Where is legal change not going to be able to accomplish what we're after? And so then sometimes you're thinking about education. And anyway.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about a particular challenge. Have you have any difficulties in this process of translating your theoretical arguments to policymakers or into the language of policy?
I'm not really sure. The truth is that although with this next project, I envision a more direct encounter. I think the closest I've come to conversations are not really with policymakers, but with judges. So that's a distinct subset. And in that context, I've found, I would say, quite a lot of receptivity, that they can see how the language of relational approach is helpful to them. But I don't really know, honestly, about the policymakers.
You've alluded already to your next project, which is a book on care. What can you advance about the book, which I know it's pretty close to completion?
So this is a book, and it hasn't taken me as long to write as Laws Relations, but I've been thinking about it for a very long time. I wrote an article a long time ago about my experiences as a young mother, and I see now that kind of the seeds of this book, co-authored book I'm now working on, were all in that initial piece about my own struggles about trying to be a full-time academic and a mother of first one and then two little boys. And then over the years, I observed that my young female colleagues, life is not getting easier for them. You would think the only thing that's better is maternity leave is not 17 weeks anymore, it's longer. But in terms of the stress that young women and young parents feel, I don't think it's gotten any better at all. And that's a pretty sad statement. My kids are now 30 and 33. So I really thought that we need some deep structural change. And so the project is to say that no one should do paid work more than 30 hours a week. This should be supported by various possibilities of economic security. Could be a guaranteed annual wage, could be much better social services. It could be a strong norm of a living wage. And I redefine that living wage as something that one person could support herself and one child on 30 hours a week. So that's the paid work side. We vastly reduced the number, especially in North America, where we work long hours compared to, say, Germany. So we reduced the paid work, and then everybody, with no exceptions, does a minimum of 22 hours of unpaid care work. So, when your children are young or your parents are frail and elderly, you'll do most of your care in your immediate family. But on this model, the amount of care you do is pretty much constant. As those immediate demands recede, you join a community of care, which could be a faith community, it could be a soccer club, it could be a choir, it could be a neighborhood, where you have strong norms of mutual care, so that everybody is spending their life knowing that they are both a care recipient, that none of us could live, not just as infants, but as adults, without care, and as a care provider. And the core rationale is that we learn things about the centrality of care to good relationships and a rewarding life that can only be learned by actually doing the care. And without that, we have policymakers who are ignorant of this foundational dimension of life. Right now, we organize the world not just around gender, but more broadly. Important people make policy, unimportant people do care. And that means we have ignorant policymakers.
I haven't asked you on a question which is very dear to my own work, which is on judgment. And you've, of course, mentioned Hannah Arendt as a big mentor for you. Can you tell us a little bit more about your project on judgment and if there is a book coming out as well from that project?
Yes, thank you. So I was actually quite close to finishing a book on judgment when I felt this call to do this care project, which I thought would be done in 2 years. So it's been more like 5 years, probably 6 by the time the book actually comes out. But so first, let me just make a link to the care project, and then I'll say a little bit more. So, Arendt's approach to judgment, drawing on Kant, really a central piece of it is that human beings have a capacity for what Kant and she called an enlarged mentality, which is the capacity to take the perspective of others. And for her, this is central to the human capacity to make judgments. That when we judge, what we do is we compare our own initial judgments to the perspectives of others. And we shift ours and we reflect on theirs, and by a kind of refraction and integration process, we come to our own new judgments. So I'll come back to that, but the link to care is that there's a wide variety of work that suggests that to care well for someone, you have to be able to take their perspective. So caring is a practice that teaches us what we need in order to be good judges. And this is a capacity which is central to our role as democratic citizens. So I see this really important link between a demand that everybody care so that they foster this basic human capacity of taking the perspectives of others. Going back to the question of human rights, I have written an article about this, and it's an article I've come back to and revised in various formulations that I think many of the debates we have about rights, especially things like, religion versus rights, culture versus rights, those disputes are better captured in terms of thinking about competing communities of judgment. And that's another language of Arendt's, that when we make judgments and take the perspectives of others, it is within some community of judgment, which is characterized, as I think about it, as having enough commonality so that I can take your perspective. We understand enough about each other that I can make a reasonable effort to understand your perspective, but also that there are enough differences among us in this community that we get this important refraction of different perspectives. And that is part of what happens in the world at large, is that people live within different communities of judgment, so the communication across those communities of judgment is very difficult. And neither Kant nor Aristotle, our two biggest thinkers about judgment, talked about that, because they were both envisioning much more enclosed worlds where there was just this diversity and commonality, not the huge differences of different communities of judgment. But we live in a world where we have to think about how to do this complicated triangulation across communities of judgment. And I find all of these formulations really helpful in thinking about the biggest challenges we face as in an ever-globalizing world, where the big challenges like climate change and COVID, they are global. There is no fixing any of them but globally. And so we have to figure out how to have a respectful conversation across serious difference. And I think judgment is a really helpful framework for doing that.
And we're coming to the end of our conversation. I wanted to ask you a question about the current situation of global pandemic in which we are. If it has allowed you to have certain reflections about it, or certain concerns that it has raised you, certain realizations.
Thank you. So the first one is, of course, that everybody is more attentive to care than they used to be. And the massive failures of care. So in North America and even in Sweden, old age homes are just, in Ontario anyway, 80% of the COVID deaths took place in old age homes. So it's all of the fissures, all of the failures that we have, whether it's racial injustice or gender injustice or age, they've all been magnified by COVID. And the good part about this is that it has brought to people's attention our failures in these regards. But the other thing that I wanted to say about COVID and my own experience. So like many people in those first weeks of March and April, I'm over 70. And so my husband and I really, did this sheltering at home thing. And we didn't go out, we didn't go shopping. And I'm happy to say that a network of students and former students reached out and offered to shop for us. And so I really felt surrounded by a community of care. But it was a real inward turning for me in those weeks. And one of the things that I realized was that this book on care had only a tiny little section on care for the earth. And that this was really not adequate. In Law's Relations, I have a kind of apology about why it's only human-to-human relations that book is about. And I thought, oh my God, I'm about to do it again. I'm gonna write a book that's only about human-to-human relationships on care. And so I stopped for about 2 to 3 months and was reading books, mostly Indigenous authors, some people who teach kind of nature and environment to young children, about how we learn about the earth, how we come to actually experience a mutual human to earth care relationship, and why so many of us are so disconnected that the idea of a mutual human earth care, which is central to so much Indigenous thinking, seems foreign to us. And so it really fits very well with the framework that I have for the care book, that we need to do it. We need to be engaged in caring for the earth in many, many different ways in order to actually come to experience this mutual responsibility. And so I now have not as big a section as it could be. It could be a whole book, but it does now play a much more significant role in the book than it would have if I had just finished the book without COVID. So I'm actually very grateful for that.
And with that, I just want to thank you very much for agreeing to talk with us. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm looking forward to continuing our conversation over different medium post-COVID.
Me too. Great. Thanks a lot.